The day Elvis Presley was arrested for a hip-swivel, the true story the world forgot. March 18, 1956, 10:30 a.m., Jacksonville Airport, Florida. The air was electric, not from the weather, but from the hysteria. The crowd, composed mainly of teenagers, was a chaotic sea of screams and hormones. In the eye of the hurricane, trying to walk toward the plane, was the phenomenon, Elvis Presley. At 21 years old, he wore a leather jacket and sported the famous pompadour, a living symbol of rebellion. The tour was at its peak, but local authorities, shocked by his hip swivel and the reaction of young girls, were lying in wait. Elvis's dilemma was simple yet intense: continue to be the force of nature that had set American music on fire, or yield to the conservative pressure that viewed him as a moral threat. He walked, shoulders tense, knowing that at any moment the show could stop. Suddenly, confusion. A photographer bumped into a police officer. Chaos erupted. Elvis found himself in the middle of a scuffle, a push, a shout, and then he felt the cold hand on his arm. The officer's harsh voice, "You're under arrest for inciting a riot." The world stopped. The king of rock, the symbol of youth freedom, was being taken into custody, handcuffed, not for singing, but for existing. The scene was unbelievable. What truly happened at that airport, and what was the price the legend had to pay for igniting the fire of revolution? We celebrate the gold records, the mansion, and the Vegas myth, but the true story of Elvis is the story of a battle, the war between artistic freedom and the Puritan morality of post-war America. The day Elvis was arrested was not an isolated incident. It was ground zero for cultural repression, the moment the establishment decided that rock music was too dangerous. This is not just the story of a celebrity in a police station. It's about the human value of fighting for the right to express oneself. It's about the price of authenticity. If you believe art should be free and that the courage to be who you are is worth the risk, this story will resonate deeply. It is a dive into the heart of the America that tried to stifle rock and roll. Subscribe to the channel now and hit the bell, because the real cost of being the king was measured in the hours he spent in a cell.
The pressure increased exponentially. In every city, the police chief made a threat. In Miami, Elvis was warned he would be arrested if he became too obscene. In St. Louis, he was forced to sing without moving his hips. But it was in Jacksonville, Florida, that the fear materialized into the fall. The city was saturated with conservatism. The Justice of the Peace, E.J. Booth, warned Elvis he would stop him. The show that followed was a masterpiece of tension and rebellion. Elvis, defying the court order, made small movements, subtle gestures with his little finger, winks that amounted to an act of rebellion. The audience, in ecstasy, understood the message. The king was fighting for them. The most difficult moment, where all seemed lost, was not on stage, but during the exit. The crowd of fans and onlookers was uncontrollable. Airport security failed. Chaos erupted. And destiny was fulfilled. Elvis was arrested on charges of inciting a riot, assault, and attempted affray. He, the biggest name in music, was booked, taken to the police station, and the news exploded worldwide. Fame had taken him to the top, but fame, combined with Puritan morality, threw him into the cold cell. He was alone, humiliated, with his leather jacket crumpled, thinking, "I just wanted to sing, and now I'm a criminal." In that cell, at his most vulnerable moment, the encounter that changed the course of history was not with a fan or a lawyer, but with Colonel Tom Parker. Parker, his manager, was not an angel, but a relentless mentor, a genius of manipulation and merchandising. He was the symbolic figure of control and pragmatism. While Elvis languished in the cell, Parker did not panic. He saw gold. He saw an image turning point. But Colonel did not rescue Elvis with an emotional speech, but with a Cold War plan. The arrest would not be a scandal. It would be proof that Elvis was real, dangerous, and worth the ticket price. Parker transformed the charge of inciting a riot into a testimony of power. The narrative became, "They are afraid of him. That's why he is the king."
Parker's act of kindness, or revelation, was a cold, calculating demonstration of loyalty. He paid the bail. He ensured that Elvis was treated with a mixture of respect and fear by the authorities, who already realized the mistake they had made in arresting a force of nature. But the true gesture of transformation was the communication strategy. Parker instructed Elvis not to apologize, but to reaffirm his purpose. He transformed the airport chaos into viral marketing. The photo of Elvis's booking was never taken, but the story of the arrest spread like wildfire. The Colonel orchestrated a narrative where Elvis was the heroic victim, the poor boy, fighting the establishment. The song became, "They are afraid of him, that's why he is the king." The resolution was immediate and seismic. The Jacksonville arrest incident cemented Elvis's image as the definitive rebel. His record sales exploded. He was acquitted of the charges. The arrest did not destroy him, it canonized him. Decades later, rock and roll would not be what it is without that resistance. The authorities' fear proved to the youth that they were on the right side of history. The price Elvis paid in Jacksonville was the loss of his innocence and the beginning of his fear of authority, a fear that would lead him years later to beg a secret agent badge from Nixon. But the positive consequence was that his arrest liberated millions of teenagers. Elvis's fight to move his hips became the youth's fight for cultural freedom. The story of Elvis's arrest is a reflective conclusion about the eternal conflict between creation and control. The day Elvis was arrested was not about a fight at an airport, it was about the rejection of mediocrity. Elvis's life teaches us that, to start a revolution, you have to be willing to be the most hated and most loved person in the room. You have to pay the price of chaos. The price of Jacksonville was the guarantee that music would never be quiet again. The lesson is universal. Do not let the fear of others dictate the volume of your own voice. The true prison was not in the Jacksonville cell, but in the silence that society tried to impose. The memory of the king should not be forgotten, but that of the soldier who fought to dance, even less so. The lesson is universal. Do not let the fear of others dictate the volume of your own voice. The true prison was not in the Jacksonville cell, but in the silence that society tried to impose. The memory of the king should not be forgotten, but that of the soldier who fought to dance, even less so. The incident of March 18, 1956 in Jacksonville was the inflection point where the myth became fuel. America was divided. On one side, the youth, thirsty for a voice that would break free from parental rigidity. On the other, the conservative silent majority, who saw rock and roll as the Trojan horse of moral decay and racial miscegenation. Elvis's arrest provided the headline that both sides needed. For the Puritans, it was proof that he was a criminal, an inciter of disorder. For the youth, it was the sanctification of their idol. He was so revolutionary that the law itself tried to contain him. The media exploited the case with veracity. Newspapers in New York and Los Angeles, which viewed the phenomenon more liberally, turned Elvis into a martyr of expression. Meanwhile, the Southern newspapers, especially the religious ones, stigmatized him as the embodiment of uncontrolled juvenile rebellion. Colonel Tom Parker, with his manipulative genius, did not intervene to clear Elvis's name. He intervened to maximize the controversy. He ensured that the story that Elvis was arrested for assault and inciting a riot reached every radio station, every magazine. The buzz was incalculable. The arrest became the best propaganda that money couldn't buy. However, the psychological impact on Elvis was profound and lasting. The 21-year-old who idolized authority and desperately wanted to be accepted by mainstream America was confronted with the fact that his art was seen as a crime. The humiliation of the arrest, even if brief, planted a seed of paranoia in his soul. He learned that no matter how famous he was,
Authority could, at any moment, silence and arrest him. This fear would haunt him throughout his life, fueling his later obsession with police badges, guns, and the desperate need to be validated by federal agencies, culminating in the bizarre meeting with Richard Nixon years later. The Jacksonville arrest was the initial trauma that he later tried to compensate for with an arsenal of badges and weapons.
The legal process dragged on briefly, but was inevitably filed. There was no concrete evidence that Elvis assaulted anyone, and the charge of inciting a riot crumbled under the reality that the hysteria was generated by his mere presence and not by a criminal act. But for the public and for Elvis, the verdict had already been rendered. He was the outlaw king. The irony of the story is that to satisfy the moral demands of some cities, Elvis was forced to perform shows where he sang standing still without moving his hips. These shows, where he sang under threat of arrest, were a testament to his silent resistance. He might not gyrate, but the tension, the defiance in his gaze, the contained energy in his body were even more subversive. He proved that the rebellion did not reside only in the hips, but in the soul. The ban on dancing became an act of conceptual performance, elevating his status from star to cultural symbol of resistance. Repression only amplified his message. The day Elvis was arrested was the day that rock and roll, as a social force, truly began. It was the day the myth became greater than the law, and the moment Elvis Presley accepted his destiny as the catalyst of chaos, a chaos that, paradoxically, he feared, but that his art demanded. He was arrested for one day, but that arrest liberated an entire generation to dance. The memory of the king must be celebrated, but that of the 21-year-old handcuffed for being authentic is the one that carries the greatest lesson. His story is not just rock and roll, it is the birth certificate of our freedom.
The final resolution of that March 1956 morning is that the act of repression spectacularly failed. It solidified the belief that rock music was the path to freedom. The arrest did not silence Elvis, it made him indestructible. Years later, when the same Elvis would become the moral patrolman with the Nixon badge, fighting against what he saw as the subversion of drugs, he was, tragically and unconsciously, fighting the ghost of his own past, the rebel who was handcuffed in Jacksonville. He spent the rest of his life trying to prove he was not the criminal that Florida accused him of being. The reflective conclusion is a meditation on the cycle of rebellion and conformity. The story of Elvis's arrest teaches us that every great revolution is preceded by a failed act of repression. Freedom is not given, it is taken, often with a hip swivel, a scream, and, occasionally, a handcuff. The true tribute to the king is not just listening to his music, but having the courage to move your hips when the world insists you must stand still. Because some stories define the world we inhabit. The reflective conclusion of this saga is the cold and necessary analysis of American morality. The day Elvis was arrested in Jacksonville was the day America revealed its greatest fear, the fear of emotional disorder. Society could tolerate war and institutionalized racism, but it could not tolerate the sight of teenagers, especially girls, losing control of their emotions and their bodies in public. Elvis's hip swivel was the breaking of the sexual taboo, and the price he paid was the price that society demands of those who dare to challenge its repression.
The philosophical lesson of that incident is not in Elvis, but in the police officers who handcuffed him. They were the agents of fear, the tools of a generation that feared the freedom that its own prosperity had generated. Elvis was the mirror the conservative America did not want to face. By imprisoning Elvis's body for a few hours, the law tried to imprison the spirit of rock and roll for decades, and it failed. The Jacksonville story therefore becomes an eternal paradox. The greatest attempt at cultural repression became its greatest catalyst. Elvis's resistance, his refusal to apologize for being himself, taught youth that authenticity was a more powerful weapon than any badge or law. The tragic epilogue of this story is Elvis's adult life. The paranoia sown in that 1956 cell blossomed into the obsession with becoming an agent of order, an ally of the force that once arrested him. The frantic search for federal badges was his unconscious attempt to reverse the trauma of Jacksonville. He wanted to be the policeman, not the arrested. He wanted the power to dictate order rather than be a victim of it. This cycle of repression and compensation is what makes his story so humanly painful. He spent his entire life trying to prove himself good and patriotic to the same society that had stigmatized him. The universal moral is clear. The fear of freedom manifests as tyranny. And true art will always be subversive because it insists on speaking the truth of the body and soul even when society demands silence and pretense. The memory of Elvis should be a call to courage. If his voice, his dance, and his mere existence were enough to scare the law, imagine the power that your own truth carries. Elvis's true legacy is not the final show in Vegas, but the first cry of defiance in Florida.
The true tribute to the king is not just listening to his music, but having the courage to move your hips when the world insists you must stand still, because some stories define the world we inhabit. The final analysis of the day of the arrest in Jacksonville must focus on the visual symbolism. That day, Elvis was dressed in a leather jacket, an unofficial uniform of rebellion that he had adopted. The leather jacket was not just fashion, it was armor. It symbolized the bad boy style, the fusion of motorcyclist and rocker, the man who did not bow to the rules. When the police put their hands on him, handcuffing that icon in leather, they were symbolically handcuffing the freedom that youth yearned for. The contrast between the coldness of the metal handcuffs and the subversive warmth of the leather jacket is the aesthetic dilemma of that era. Years later, in the Vegas phase, Elvis would exchange the black leather, a symbol of rebellion, for white glittering jumpsuits, a symbol of purity and near divinity. This change in clothing was not accidental. It was an unconscious attempt to cleanse the stain of Jacksonville. The white jumpsuit was the attire of luxury conformity, a way of telling society, I am harmless now. I am a showman, not a threat. But the irony is that while he wore white to be accepted, his internal body was an open rebellion, destroyed by drugs, which led to his death. Style was the lie he told the world. The 1956 arrest taught Elvis that authenticity has a very high price. The price is conflict and persecution. Elvis's life cycle is therefore a tragic tale of how an artist can be consumed by the very image he tried to create to survive. He was arrested for being too real in 1956 and later became a prisoner of an image that was too fake in 1977. The true legacy of Jacksonville is that it forces us to question what it really means to be free. Is freedom not being afraid to move your hips, or is it not needing a badge to justify your existence? The reflective conclusion is the synthesis. Elvis Presley was a walking paradox, the conservative who was arrested for being radical, the patriot who was seen as subversive, the richest man in the world who died of emotional misery. His story is a cautionary beacon for all who seek fame. It can give you the stage, but it cannot give you the comfort of a true home. The 1956 arrest was the point of no return that forced him to choose between being Aaron, the man, and Elvis, the myth. He chose the myth and paid the final price for that decision.